Hi, I'm Topher Browne. I've been an instructor for about 30 years. I hope to share with you some of the teaching points that I've learned to keep fly casting as simple as possible. I hope this video will make your fly casting more enjoyable and easier to do. So what is fly casting? Fly casting is how we propel a fly to the target, and it's perhaps misnamed and should be called fly line casting because we are actually casting a fly line and the fly comes along for the ride. The fly in this case is a small piece of yarn, and if we were trout fishing it would be essentially weightless dry fly or a nymph. And so it's the line that takes our fly to the target. In spin casting it's different. The weight of the lure is what pulls the line to the target. But the two styles of casting are fairly similar in terms of a lot of the mechanics, and we'll talk about that later. The loop is a term that you're going to hear in fly casting, and it's the aerodynamic shape that your fly line takes as it moves through the air and propels your fly to the target. The term tight loop refers to the top of the top leg and the bottom leg being quite close together. An open loop means they're further apart. Loops are important, but you don't want to get fixated on them. It's far more important to have good mechanics and to make sure that you're moving the rod in the right way than it is to look at your loops and focus on the loop exclusively. Now that we know what fly casting is and we've defined a loop, let's take a look at some of the casting fundamentals. And I like to start from the ground up with my feet, and we call it stance. And stance is the optimal position for your feet, both from a stability point when wading a river. You definitely want to separate your feet, either your left foot forward or your right foot forward. And it gives you better balance in the stream, and it also allows you to make a weight transfer when you're casting. So ideally, a little bit of a weight transfer, just like throwing a ball, is the easiest way to fly cast. If you have your right foot forward and your left foot back and you're casting with your right hand, we would call that a closed stance. And that's the best stance to use for accuracy fly casting. Tends to keep your body in line with the target. If you have your right foot back and your left foot forward, we call that an open stance, and that allows you to turn and make a longer stroke with your casting hand. So stance before you step into the stream is important. You want to make sure that you're in an athletic stance so you don't fall down, and then you want to make sure that you're in a stance that maximizes whether you're going for accuracy or for distance. Closed stance for accuracy, open stance for distance. Now that we have our feet set, let's take a look at how we hold the rod. The ideal grip is to have your thumb pointing up the rod and to separate the four fingers just a little bit. And this gives you a little bit more control than a less than ideal grip, which would look something like this. I would avoid this grip, try and separate those fingers. The grip is very similar to the forehand grip on a tennis racket. It's very similar to the lower grip on a golf club. And we also call this the V grip because there's a nice little V formed between the forefinger and the thumb. If you have that V pointing up the rod, you're in a good position to fly cast. The line hand is pretty self-explanatory. You've got your right hand, if you're right-handed holding onto the rod, we call that the rod hand. The line hand, we just use the thumb and the forefinger to hold onto it, and that's pretty much all you need to know. Once we get into shooting line, which is how we extend the length of our cast, it's important to have a grip like this because then you can let go and get the line out of your hand quite easily. Now that we're holding the rod and the line correctly, let's talk about where our hand should be when we're casting. There is such a thing as having your hand too low. There's also such a thing as having your hand too high. And the optimum place to hold the rod for casting efficiency and also so you don't get tired, I like to think of the thumb being somewhere between the top of my shoulder and my ear. So somewhere in this range right here. Another way to envision this is that if you were going to make a cast at 35 or 40 feet, where would your hand be if you grabbed a baseball and you were going to throw it that same distance? And it's generally right about in here. And that will be a recurring theme throughout this video, that fly casting and throwing are pretty similar motions. So if you're ever wondering where your hand should be, you can take the rod, put it down, and envision a throw to that distance. And that's where your hand should be when you're fly casting. The other term that I'd like to introduce you to is stroke length. Stroke length is the distance that the rod hand travels to the target and then back again to throw a back cast behind us. So stroke length should be appropriate for the distance that you're casting. So a good way to think about that is if you're making a short cast of, say, 25 feet, you're not going to need much stroke in order to cast 25 feet. If you were going to lengthen that cast out to 50 feet, then your stroke has to get longer because you'll presumably have more line in the air before you shoot to the target. And we'll discuss shooting in just a minute. Now that you know how to hold the rod and the line and move the rod, let's talk about the role of the wrist. A good analogy for fly casting is throwing a ball. And everybody's thrown a ball. And if you only throw with just your wrist, it's not going to go very far. So when we throw a ball, we try to engage our whole arm. And guess what? We have stroke length with the whole arm. And the wrist kind of follows through at the very end when throwing a ball. And that is what we're also doing when fly casting. So we've got that nice stroke length with the hand, and then watch how little wrist you need on that forward cast. It's just a little tiny wrist at the very, very end. Very similar to the turnover of the wrist when you're throwing a ball. And we have that same thing on the back cast. So we make a stroke on the back cast, and there's a tiny, tiny little bit of wrist in there. What we want to avoid is having too much wrist on that back cast. And a good way to visualize what's going on the back cast without having to look at it is to look at the angle of the butt of the rod and the underside of your arm. And if you can keep that at about 45 degrees, your wrist is under control. If it starts to creep up to 90 degrees, then you're in trouble. So controlled wrist keeps it anywhere from about 45 degrees or even 30 degrees, and then I have a nice straight line running up my forehand, right through the thumb, and all the way up through the rod. The last term that we're really going to focus on is the rod stop. The best way to think of the rod stop is it unloads the energy that's stored in the fly rod. So when the fly rod is bent, that's what we call a loaded fly rod. And in order to propel our fly line to the target, we have to unload it or straighten it out. And the stop on both the back cast and the forward cast is how we unload that fly rod. A stop on the back cast is generally, from the caster's perspective, right around 2 o'clock on a clock face. And that would be a good stop for your back cast. On the forward cast, the stop is something like 10 o'clock. And that will give us the loop that we introduced as the very first talking point on this video. And the loop is what's going to take our fly line to the target. If we go too far back, and notice my wrist is 90 degrees, that's not so good. And if I go too far forward, you can think of that as never really unloading the fly rod. And I put a bend in it when I make the stroke, and when I stop the rod, that's what unloads the rod and takes my fly line to where I want to go. So that rod stop is pretty darn important. And you can think of it as somewhere between 10 and 2. It doesn't really matter if it's 2 and 10, as long as it's somewhere right where you would normally stop. A spinning rod, a bait casting rod, a fly rod, they're all the same. 10 and 2, 2 and 10. So now that we've taken a look at the theory of casting, let's make a few casts. I'm going to start with an athletic stance. My feet are separated, got my right foot forward to give me a little bit more accuracy. Got my V grip, thumb on top, forefinger up the rod, and I'm holding the line in my left hand. And I'm going to lift the line, make a back cast, and then a forward cast. And what I want you to see here is the height of the right hand. You can think of your thumb being somewhere between your shoulder and your right ear as being the optimal position. And my stroke length, because I don't have a lot of line out, is pretty short. So my stroke is from about here to about here. So call that a foot to 14 inches. I'll do it again. I'm going to pick up the line, back cast, forward cast, pick it up again, back cast, forward cast. Now let's head down to the water and we'll make a few of these casts in an actual fishing situation. Now we're on the water, and remember when you start fly casting to always have a pair of sunglasses or safety glasses to protect your eyes from errant flies or the line or the leader hitting your eyes. Safety first before you start casting. One of the most challenging parts of moving to the water is how do you get the fly line off your reel and into the water. What I do is I pull the line off the reel first, all the line that I'm going to need to fish, then I point the rod towards the water and I slowly move the line back and forth with my rod while I feed slack down the rod guides with my left hand. I'm just smoothly feeding it. Now I'm ready to cast. The big problem that I have still at this particular point is I've got a lot of slack line in front of me, and the best way to get that slack line tight so we can do what we call a pickup and a lay down cast is just to roll it out in front of you. So I'm going to do that again so you can see it. Lots of slack. This also happens when you do a fly change. And I'm just going to roll it out until that line is more or less straight. Once the line is straight, we're going to do a cast called a pickup and a lay down, which you point the rod at the water. I like to have the tip of the rod touching the water as a good reminder that that rod tip should be low. Pick up the line, make your back cast, make your forward cast, and then slowly bring that rod tip down to the water again. So this is where the rod stops are important. And from the earlier section where we talked about the rod stop, there's a rod stop on the back cast, lift, back cast, forward cast, stop the rod, and then we drop the tip back down to the water so that we could set the hook on a fish or so that we could make another cast. That very first part, which we call the lift, is just breaking some of that surface tension from the line against the water. If you don't lift, you tend to spook any fish, and it also shocks your back cast, making it very difficult to control it. So if you can start with your rod tip low on the pickup and lay down cast and lift most of that before you make that back cast with a stop, then on your forward cast, make the forward stroke and then slowly lower that rod back down to the water. So 2 parts to the back cast, 2 parts to the forward cast. It's a lift, part 1, back cast, part 2, forward stroke, part 3, and then drop that tip back down to the water. In real time, it looks like this. Lift, back cast, stop the rod, forward cast, stop the rod, slowly lower that tip back down. We'll do it one more time. Lift, back cast, stop the rod, forward cast, stop the rod, slowly lower it back down to the water. The pickup and lay down is a great cast to start out with. You don't have to worry about keeping line in the air multiple times with a false cast at first. We'll cover that in just a moment. And importantly, it also keeps your fly in the water. And a lot of people forget that if the fly is in the air, you're not really fishing. So if you can make a back cast and put your fly right back down on the water, it maximizes your fishing time and makes sure that the fly is in the water, because fish are in the water, they're not in the air. So let's expand on the pickup and the lay down cast. Pickup, lay down cast, as you remember, is picking up the line, back cast, forward cast, and lay it right back down on the water again. A false cast is where you keep the line in the air like this. One of the advantages of false casting is it sets us up to make a longer cast, which we'll learn how to do in just a moment. It's also a great cast for drying out your dry fly, and it's also a little bit more stealthy than a pickup and a laydown cast if you're fishing to trout or other spooky fish where you don't want the line to land on the water until the very last cast. So how do we make a false cast? Well, the very first part of the false cast is something that you already know how to do if you can do the pickup, which is lift some of that line out of the water, back cast, stop the rod. Now we're going to just keep the line in the air for 3 false casts and then lay it back down again. I'm going to do that again. Pick it up, back cast, forward cast, keep it in the air. 2 more times. Nice stop on the forward stroke. Slowly lower that rod down to the water. The false cast is what most people do to lengthen out their line, but you can also lengthen out your line with a pickup and a lay down cast. False casting also allows you to practice those rod stops over and over and over again. And remember, those rod stops are critical to forming a loop, which is what makes our back cast travel and straighten out, which we have to do before we do the same thing going forward, which is make a nice stroke to a stop on the forward cast. So false casting is something that you can do practicing on a lawn. Pick up in a lay down cast you can practice on a lawn, but the false cast is ultimately how we're going to lengthen our line for a longer cast. Once you've learned to false cast, we have our rod hand on the rod, our line hand on the line. Not too complicated. The way we lengthen our line from a false cast or a pickup and a laydown cast is to let go of that line after the forward stop. So you have to stop the rod on the forward cast, let go of the line, and the timing is exactly the same as it would be for a spinning rod or even a bait casting rod. So if you can spin cast, if you can bait cast, you can also not only fly cast, but you can also shoot line when fly casting. So 3 false casts, stop, let go, shoot the line out. Now I need a way to get that line back in, because I let out maybe 10 feet of line, and I don't want to have to pick up that entire length of line. Much, much easier to pull some of that line in and then shoot that additional 10 feet to get back to where I am right now. The easiest way to do that is to use something that we call 2-point control. And 2-point control is 1 point on the rod, and then you're going to grip the line with the forefinger and middle finger and pull the line from behind your rod hand until you get to the spot where you're comfortable casting the length of line. Before you shoot the line, you're going to have to let go here. Otherwise, you would have to let go of the rod altogether in order to shoot the line. So releasing that 2-point control before you make your next false cast is important if you're going to shoot the line. Stop and let go. To shoot line, just remember stop and let go. 2-point control, strip from behind the rod hand. A lot of people think, well, if I grab the line up here, I can strip that much more line in. Stripping meaning pulling the line in. It's actually slower than if you just strip or pull the line in from behind your hand. So here comes again. 1, 2 false cast, stop, let go. And now I'm going to strip or pull that line back in until I have a good length of line that I'm comfortable casting. Now I can shoot again. Shooting line is also a lot of fun. It's pretty addictive to shoot line even if there's no fish around. And that's everything you need to know to get started with fly casting. We covered a lot of ground, from stance to grip, all the way to pick up and lay down cast, to false casts and shooting line. And I hope it's been informative. We are also going to release an intermediate casting video, so be sure to hit that subscribe button so that we can alert you to future videos in this series. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you on the water.